The tray of crystal champagne flutes trembled just slightly in Imani's hands, a betrayal of the exhaustion dragging at her bones. She adjusted her grip, the starched white cuffs of her uniform shirt digging into her wrists, contrasting sharply with the deep crimson of her velvet vest. It was past 11 at the Gold Leaf, the kind of establishment where the lighting was always dim enough to hide secrets and the silence was expensive. Imani kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the path between the marble tables, navigating the space with the practiced invisibility of someone who knew that being seen was dangerous. She had spent the last 20 minutes in the employee bathroom applying a thick layer of concealer around the edge of the bandage on her jaw, praying the adhesive wouldn't peel under the humidity of the kitchen. The throbbing in her cheek was a dull, hot rhythm that matched her heartbeat, a constant reminder of the mistake she had made yesterday, the mistake of being 2 days late with a payment. She didn't have the luxury of tears. She had Sophie at home, sleeping on a mattress that was too thin depending on the shift to keep the lights on. Imani took a shallow breath, the air smelling of truffle oil and expensive perfume, and moved toward table 4. But the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden vacuum of sound. The low hum of conversation from the city's elite died instantly, replaced by a tension so thick it felt like the air pressure had dropped before a storm. Imani looked up, her instincts screaming at her to freeze. A group of 5 men had entered, moving with a synchronized, predatory fluidity that made the wealthy patrons in the room look like soft, startled prey. In the center of the formation walked a man who made the darkness of the room seem to bend toward him. He was tall, wearing a suit cut so sharply it looked like armor, his charcoal hair swept back from a face that was devastatingly handsome and terrifyingly cold. Taewook did not look around the room with the eager curiosity of a guest. He scanned it with the strategic boredom of an owner, or perhaps an executioner. He was the kind of man rumors were built on, stories of a Korean syndicate that moved through the city's underbelly like smoke, controlling shipping lanes and skylines alike. Imani felt a chill ripple down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She tried to step back into the shadows near the service station, to become part of the wallpaper, but fate was cruel tonight. As Taewook passed the center aisle, a busboy, flustered by the sudden heavy presence, clipped Imani's shoulder. She stumbled just a fraction, but it was enough. The tray tilted. A single flute slid, teetering on the edge. Before it could crash, a hand shot out, fast, blurringly fast, and caught the stem of the glass midair. Imani gasped, her eyes snapping up to meet a gaze as dark and deep as the ocean at midnight. Taewook held the glass, but he wasn't looking at the champagne. He was looking at her. Specifically, his eyes had locked onto the jagged, slightly peeling edge of the bandage on her jawline. The world stopped. The silence in the restaurant stretched tight, a wire ready to snap. Taewook didn't hand the glass back immediately. He held it suspended between them, a bridge she didn't want to cross. His fingers were long, elegant, and steady, utterly at odds with the violence she sensed coiled beneath his skin. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She needed to apologize, to take the glass, to retreat, but her voice died in her throat. Up close, he was overwhelming. He smelled of rain and sandalwood and something metallic, like the aftermath of a gun firing. He didn't smile. His expression was a mask of perfect indifference, except for his eyes, which were narrowing slightly, analyzing the bruising blooming faintly beneath the concealer she had applied so carefully. He saw it. He saw the ugliness she was trying to hide, the poverty and the violence that didn't belong in this gilded cage. "I'm sorry, sir," she finally whispered, the words trembling. "Thank you. I'll take that." She reached for the glass, desperate to break the contact. But Taewook didn't let go. He held the flute firm, forcing her to stay within his orbit. "Leave it," he said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a request. He placed the glass on the nearest table, without looking away from her face. The restaurant manager, a sweating man named Miller, rushed forward, his face pale. "Mr. Kim, my apologies. She's new. She's clumsy. I'll have her removed immediately." Taewook raised one hand, a sharp, cutting motion that silenced Miller instantly. "Go away," Taewook said softly, his eyes never leaving Imani. Miller evaporated into the background, terrified. Now it was just them. Imani felt exposed, stripped raw by the intensity of his focus. "What is your name?" he asked. It sounded less like a question and more like he was memorizing a coordinate on a map. "Imani," she breathed. He took a step closer, invading her personal space with an arrogance that made her knees weak. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, and for a second, she flinched, a reflex born of survival. The movement was minute, a tiny recoil, but he caught it. His eyes darkened, the cold calculation shifting into something hotter, something furious. "Who touched you?" he demanded, the whisper carrying the weight of a death sentence. Imani stared at him, her breath hitching. The question was absurd. Men like him didn't care about waitresses with bruised faces. Men like him were usually the ones causing the bruises. She took a step back, clutching the empty tray against her chest like a shield. "I fell," she lied, the automatic response she had given Sophie this morning. "It was just an accident, sir. Please, I have to get back to work." She tried to move around him, but he sidestepped, blocking her path with effortless grace. He wasn't aggressive, not overtly, but he was an immovable object. "You didn't fall," Taewook said, his voice dropping to a register that felt like it was vibrating inside her skull. "The angle is wrong. That's a strike. A ring, maybe. Or a heavy handle." He analyzed the injury with a clinical, chilling precision that terrified her more than the shouting of the loan shark had. He was reading her history on her skin. "I don't know what you're talking about," Imani insisted, panic rising in her throat. If she lost this job, the sharks wouldn't just hit her next time. They would go to the apartment. They would find Sophie.
"Please."
"I need this job." The desperation in her voice cracked the veneer of his composure. Something flickered in his expression, a sudden, sharp intake of breath, as if he had been struck. He looked at her hands, gripping the tray until her knuckles were white, and then back to her eyes. He saw the fear, but he also saw the defiance. She was terrified, but she was standing her ground. "You are not safe," Taewook stated, not a question but a fact. He looked around the restaurant, his gaze sweeping over the patrons who were pretending not to watch, and then back to her. It was a look of possession, sudden and irrational and absolute. "I am fine," Imani lied again, her chin lifting. "I can take care of myself." Taewook tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle he intended to solve. He didn't believe her. He stepped in closer, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises, so close the heat of his body radiated against hers. He lowered his head until his lips were inches from her ear. The restaurant, the manager, the debt. Everything faded into a blur. "Not anymore," he whispered. "I'll protect you." The promise hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. It wasn't a comfort. It was a vow that terrified her because she knew, instinctively, that a man like Taewook didn't make idle promises. He pulled back, his face unreadable again, and walked toward the private VIP booth at the back, his entourage flowing around him like a dark tide. Imani stood frozen in the middle of the floor, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, the spot where his breath had touched her ear burning like a brand. The rest of the shift was a blur of adrenaline and dread. Imani tried to stay in the kitchen, busying herself with polishing silverware that was already gleaming, but Miller, the manager, wouldn't allow it. "Table 1 specifically requested you," he hissed, wiping sweat from his forehead with a trembling handkerchief. "Mr. Kim, do not keep him waiting." "Imani, do you know who that is? If he burns this place down, it's on your head." So she walked. She walked out onto the floor, her legs feeling like lead, carrying a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir toward the booth where Taewook sat. He had dismissed most of his men. Only one stood guard by the velvet rope, a silent sentinel with a scar running through his eyebrow. Taewook sat alone in the curved leather booth, one arm draped along the back, looking like a king on a throne. He wasn't looking at his phone or the menu. He was watching the entrance to the kitchen. Watching for her. When she approached, he didn't speak immediately. He just watched her hands as she uncorked the bottle. She was careful, precise, relying on the muscle memory of the job to keep her from shaking, but as she poured the wine, her sleeve rode up slightly. It revealed a faint, yellowing bruise on her wrist, an older mark from when she had tried to block the door 3 weeks ago. Taewook's hand shot out and wrapped around her wrist. It wasn't a hurtful grip, but it was iron hard. He stopped her, the wine bottle hovering mid-pour. Imani gasped, almost dropping the bottle, but he steadied her hand with his other one. For a moment, they were a tableau of frozen motion. He turned her wrist over, inspecting the bruise with a terrifying quietness. His thumb brushed over the skin, a touch so light it felt like a ghost, contrasting violently with the dark fury gathering in his eyes. "This is not new," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it infinitely scarier. "Systemic. Recurring." He looked up at her, and the intensity of his gaze made her want to weep. "Who is he? A husband? A father?" Imani yanked her wrist back, the shame burning hotter than the fear. "It's none of your business," she snapped, her voice low. "You're a customer. I'm a waitress. Please let go." Taewook released her slowly, his fingers trailing away reluctantly. "It became my business when I saw the blood you tried to hide with powder," he said calm. "I don't like broken things, Imani. And I don't like seeing beauty wasted on survival." The audacity of him, to sit there in a suit that cost more than her life's earnings and judge her survival, sparked a flash of anger that overrode her fear. "You don't know anything about survival," she whispered harshly, glancing around to make sure Miller wasn't watching. "You think because you have money and men with guns that you can just fix things? Some things aren't fixed. They're endured. I have people who depend on me. I don't need a savior, and I certainly don't need a gangster making my life more complicated." She expected him to get angry. She expected him to snap his fingers and have her fired. Instead, Taewook looked at her with something like respect. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, a microscopic smile that didn't reach his eyes, but softened the hard lines of his face. "Endurance is a virtue," he conceded, picking up his wine glass. "But everyone has a breaking point. Tonight, you reached yours." He took a sip, his eyes locking onto hers over the rim. "I will wait outside when your shift ends." Imani felt the blood drain from her face. "No," she said quickly. "Do not do that. I wasn't asking for permission," Taewook replied, turning his attention to the room, dismissing her. "Go. Serve the other tables. But do not think you are leaving this building without me." The clock struck 2 a.m., and the gold leaf was finally empty. The silence of the closed restaurant was usually Imani's favorite part of the day, the moment she could breathe, count her tips, and rush home to check on Sophie. But tonight, the silence felt heavy, oppressive. She changed out of her uniform in record time, pulling on her worn, oversized hoodie and jeans, trying to make herself look small, insignificant. She checked her phone. No messages from Sophie. That was good. It meant her sister was asleep. Imani slipped out the back exit, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind her. The alleyway was narrow, lined with overflowing dumpsters and smelling of stale beer and rain. It was a shortcut to the subway, a path she took every night because it saved 10 minutes. She pulled her hood up, clutching her bag tight to her chest. She took 3 steps before a shadow detached itself from the wall. Her heart stopped. It wasn't Taewook. The figure was shorter, stockier, smelling of cheap cologne and tobacco. It was Vargas. Vargas was the muscle for the loan shark her father had borrowed from before he disappeared. He was a brute of a man, all knuckles and malice. He stepped into the pale yellow light of the street lamp, a cruel grin splitting his face. "Imani, baby," he crooned, blocking her path. "You're late, and you're short on the envelope this week." Imani stepped back, her back hitting the cold brick of the restaurant wall. "I paid you," she said, her voice shaking. "I paid you everything I had on Tuesday. You said I had until next week for the interest." Vargas laughed, a wet, ugly sound. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket, flicking it open. The blade glinted in the dim light. "Interest rates went up," he said, stepping closer. "Boss says you're holding out on us. Maybe you need another reminder? The one on your face looks like it's healing." "Too nice." He reached for her, the knife tip tracing a circle in the air. Imani froze, the terror paralyzing her. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the pain, for the cut, for the blood. But the blow never came. Instead, there was a sound, a soft, wet thud, and a gasp of surprise from Vargas. Imani opened her eyes. Vargas was still there, but he was no longer looking at her. He was looking down at his hand, which was empty. The knife was skittering across the pavement, kicked away by a shoe made of Italian leather. Standing between Imani and the threat was Taewook. He hadn't made a sound. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed, almost bored. But the air around him was freezing. Vargas blinked, confused, then angry. "Who the hell are you?" Vargas snarled, stepping forward, raising a fist. "Get lost, pretty boy. Unless you want a new smile." Taewook didn't move. He didn't even take his hands out of his pockets. He just looked at Vargas with a profound, terrifying disappointment. "You are the one who marked her?" Taewook asked, his voice conversational, polite even. Vargas sneered. "Yeah, I marked her. And I'm gonna mark you." Vargas lunged. It was a clumsy, brawling move. Taewook moved like smoke. He stepped inside Vargas's guard, one hand finally leaving his pocket to clamp onto Vargas's throat. It happened so fast Imani couldn't track it. One moment Vargas was attacking. The next, he was pinned against the opposite wall, his feet dangling 3 inches off the ground. Taewook held him there with one hand, his arm extended, his expression unchanged. There was no strain on his face, no effort, just raw, terrifying power. "I asked you a question," Taewook said softly to the choking man. "You touched her face?" Vargas clawed at Taewook's hand, his eyes bulging, gasping for air. He couldn't speak. Taewook tilted his head. "She is not yours to touch," he stated. "She is not yours to debt. She is not yours to see." He tightened his grip, and Vargas made a strangled, pathetic noise. Imani watched, horrified and mesmerized. She had spent 2 years terrified of Vargas, and Taewook was holding him like a rag doll. "Let him go," Imani whispered, finding her voice. "Please." "You'll kill him." Taewook looked back at her. The darkness in his eyes cleared for a second, replaced by that strange, intense focus. "He hurt you," Taewook said simply, as if that explained everything. "He deserves to break. If you kill him, more will come," Imani said, stepping forward, her hand reaching out to hover near Taewook's arm, though she didn't dare touch him. "Please. Just let him go." Taewook looked at her hand, then back to Vargas. With a sneer of disgust, he released his grip. Vargas crumpled to the pavement, coughing, retching, gasping for air. He scrambled backward on the ground, looking up at Taewook with pure terror. "Get out," Taewook said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. Vargas scrambled to his feet and ran, stumbling down the alley, disappearing into the night without looking back. Silence returned to the alley, but it was different now. It was the silence of a vacuum after an explosion. Taewook took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his hand, as if touching Vargas had dirted him. Then he turned to Imani. The violence drained out of his frame, leaving only the man she had seen in the restaurant. He looked at her bandage, then at her eyes. "Come," he said, gesturing toward the end of the alley where a sleek, black sedan was idling, its headlights cutting through the gloom. "I cannot leave you here." Imani looked at the car, then at the man who had just dismantled her nightmare with one hand. Every instinct, she had told her not to get in the car with a stranger, especially a dangerous one. But then she looked at the empty alley where Vargas had fled. She knew he would come back. She knew she wasn't safe anymore. She looked at Taewook, and for the first time, she saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't trying to own her. He was angry for her. "Where?" she asked softly. Taewook opened the back door of the car, the interior light revealing cream leather seats, a sanctuary. "Somewhere the shadows cannot find you," he promised. And for the first time in her life, Imani stopped fighting the gravity. She stepped toward him. The drive to the penthouse was a blur of city lights streaking against the tinted windows, a silent movie of a world Imani had always watched from the outside. The silence inside the car was not empty. It was pressurized, filled with the hum of the engine and the overwhelming presence of the man sitting beside her. Taewook did not speak. He didn't try to comfort her with empty platitudes. He simply sat with a terrifying stillness, his gaze fixed on the passing skyline, one hand resting on his knee, the other tapping a slow, silent rhythm against the leather armrest. When the car finally glided into the private underground garage of a glass and steel tower that pierced the clouds, Imani felt a fresh wave of vertigo. This was the Citadel, the most exclusive residential building in the city, a place where people like her were only allowed in through the service entrance. But tonight, The doorman held the lobby door open, his eyes widening slightly as he saw Taewook guide her through the marble foyer. Taewook's hand hovered at the small of her back, never touching, yet creating a force field that steered her toward the private elevator. The ascent made her ears pop. When the door slid open, revealing a living space that spanned the entire floor, walls of glass overlooking the sleeping city, Imani felt small. She hugged her arms around herself, conscious of her cheap hoodie, her worn sneakers, the smell of the alley still clinging to her clothes. "The bathroom is through the left corridor," Taewook said, breaking the silence. His voice was lower now, stripped to the command he used on his men. "There are clean clothes.
Robes.
Whatever you need. Wash the city off you." He walked to a sleek, dark wood cabinet and poured a glass of water, not alcohol, setting it on the quartz island. "I will wait here." When Imani emerged 20 minutes later, scrubbed raw and wrapped in a plush charcoal robe that swallowed her frame, she found Taewook sitting on the edge of a white sofa, a first aid kit open on the coffee table. He had discarded his suit jacket, his dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by faint, jagged scars, evidence of the violence he commanded. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time, she saw fatigue in his eyes, a crack in the armor. He gestured for her to sit. Imani hesitated, then sat on the opposite end of the cushion. "Come closer," he murmured. "I cannot help you from there." She scooted forward, her heart thumping against her ribs. He reached out, his fingers cool and dry, and gently tilted her chin upward. The proximity was dizzying. She could count the dark lashes framing his eyes. She could see the flecks of amber in his irises. He began to peel away the old, damp bandage on her jaw. She flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through her teeth.
Taewook throatse instantly.
"I know," he whispered, his voice a caress. "I know it hurts, but we must clean it properly. The infection is worse than the pain." He worked with a surgeon's precision, swabbing the angry, purple bruise and the cut Vargas had left days ago. He applied an ointment that stung like ice, then fire, his eyes never leaving the wound. It was the most intimate moment of her life. He wasn't kissing her, he wasn't undressing her, but he was handling her pain with a reverence that made her chest ache. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Taewook finished applying a fresh, sterile dressing, his thumb lingering on her cheekbone, just above the tape. He looked into her eyes, and the air between them grew heavy, charged with a magnetic pull. "Because," he said, his voice rough, "when I saw you tonight, I realized I had been walking through this city with my eyes closed. And I do not like being blind." The morning light that flooded the penthouse was ruthless, exposing the stark reality of her situation. Imani woke up in a bed that felt like a cloud, the sheets made of Egyptian cotton that cost more than her rent. For a few seconds, she felt peace, until memory slammed into her.
Sophie.
Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She had left Sophie alone. She had been gone all night. The loan sharks knew where she lived. Vargas knew where she lived. Imani scrambled out of bed, her feet tangling in the oversized robe, and ran into the living area. The sprawling room was quiet, bathed in golden sunlight. Taewook was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, drinking espresso, reading a tablet. He turned as she burst in, wild-eyed and breathless. "I have to go," she gasped, looking for her shoes. "My sister."
Sophie.
"She's alone. If they couldn't find me, they'll go to the apartment. I have to go now." She was frantic, her hands shaking as she patted her pockets for her phone, which was dead. She expected Taewook to argue, to tell her it was too dangerous. Instead, he simply set his cup down on the glass table with a deliberate, calm click. "Sophie is eating pancakes in the kitchen," he said. The words didn't compute. Imani froze, staring at him.
"What?"
Taewook gestured vaguely toward the hallway behind the kitchen island. "She likes blueberries." My chef was instructed to accommodate. Imani ran to the kitchen. There, sitting at a marble counter that was bigger than their entire apartment, was Sophie. Her 7-year-old sister was wearing a fluffy, oversized t-shirt that clearly belonged to Taewook, swinging her legs, a plate of pancakes in front of her. A stoic man in a suit was standing by the fridge, looking uncomfortable but vigilant. "Imani," Sophie squealed, syrup on her chin. Mr. Tay sent a car. It had a TV in the back. Imani rushed forward, grabbing Sophie and burying her face in the child's hair, checking her for injuries for fear. Sophie smelled of syrup and expensive shampoo. She was safe. Imani turned slowly to face Taewook, who had followed her to the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, watching them with an expression that was unreadable, perhaps slightly guarded. "You kidnapped my sister?" Imani asked, though the anger was rapidly losing the war against gratitude. "I extracted her," Taewook corrected gently. "I sent a team 20 minutes after we arrived here. They secured the building, packed her bag, and brought her. Your door had been kicked in, Imani. If I had waited until morning, she would not be eating pancakes." The reality of his words hit her like a physical blow. They had gone to the apartment. They would have taken Sophie. Imani's legs gave out, and she sank onto one of the bar stools, trembling. Taewook walked over, entering her personal space again. He didn't touch her, but he stood between her and the door, a living barricade. "You have people to protect," he said softly, looking at Sophie, then back to Imani. "So do I. Now you're both under my roof. And in my world, what is mine is untouchable." The word mine hung in the air, possessive and terrifying and thrilling. Imani looked up at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a gangster. She saw a wall she could finally rest against. "Thank you," she whispered. Taewook reached out, tucking a stray curl behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her neck. "Do not thank me yet," he warned darkly. "The storm is still coming." The storm arrived 2 days later, not with rain, but with a phone call that shattered the fragile domestic peace of the penthouse. For 48 hours, they had lived in a suspended reality. Taewook had worked from home, turning the dining table into a command center, while Imani watched him. She saw the way he commanded respect with a whisper, the way he navigated millions of dollars and life-or-death decisions while sipping tea. They had eaten dinner together every night, the conversation moving from tentative to fluid. She learned he hated sweets but loved classical music. He learned she dreamed of owning a bakery and was afraid of thunderstorms. The romance had been a slow burn, a series of lingering glances and brushed hands, a tension building like static electricity. But on the third evening, as the sun set the city on fire, Taewook's phone rang. He answered it on speaker, his eyes locked on Imani across the room. "Kim," he said. The voice on the other end was distorted, angry. "You overstepped, Taewook. The girl is collateral. Her father's debt belongs to the syndicate. You taking her is a declaration of war. Hand her over, or we burn the gold leaf. And then we come for the glass tower." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Imani stood up, her hands clutching the back of the sofa. She knew that voice. It was the syndicate boss, the man Vargas answered to. A man who didn't make threats, only promises. Taewook didn't blink. He didn't look at the phone. He looked at Imani. He looked at her with a calm, terrifying intensity that made her breath hitch. "Let it burn," Taewook said into the phone. His voice was casual, bored even. "Burn the restaurant. Burn the block. But if you take one step toward this building, I will not just kill you. I will erase your entire lineage. I will salt the earth where your house stands." He hung up the phone without waiting for a response. The silence that followed was deafening. Imani walked toward him, her fear warring with the overwhelming realization of what he had just done. He had declared war for her. "You can't do that," she whispered. "They'll kill you. They have an army." Taewook stood up, towering over her. He reached out, grabbing her waist, pulling her flesh against him for the first time. The contact was electric, a shock to her system. "I have an army too," he growled low in his throat. "But right now, the only thing I care about is the fact that you are trembling." He ran his hands up her back, gripping her shoulders, grounding her. "They think you are a debt to be collected. They do not understand that you are not a thing." His eyes searched hers, desperate and fierce. "You are the only real thing I have found in years. Do you understand? I will burn the whole city down before I let them put another bruise on you." The confrontation did not happen at the tower. It happened on neutral ground, a warehouse district by the docks. 3 nights later, Taewook had tried to keep her behind, but Imani had refused. "I am not a parcel to be stored," she had told him, her voice shaking but firm. "If this ends tonight, I want to be there. I want to see it end, surprisingly. He had agreed. He respected her fire. Now, she sat in the armored SUV, watching through the bulletproof glass as Taewook stood under the halo of a street lamp, flanked by 6 of his men. Opposite them stood the syndicate boss and a dozen thugs, including a bandaged, limping Vargas. The tension was a physical weight.
Imani votfet Taewook.
He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a statue carved from judgment. The conversation was inaudible from the car, but the body language was clear. The syndicate boss was shouting, gesturing wildly. Taewook was still. Then, Taewook reached into his jacket. The opposing men flinched, hands going to their waistbands. But Taewook didn't pull a gun. He pulled a single, thick envelope. He tossed it onto the wet pavement between them. The boss stared at it, then signaled Vargas to pick it up. Vargas opened it, his eyes widening. He whispered something to his boss. Money. An obscene amount of money. Taewook spoke then, and though Imani couldn't hear him, she saw his lips move. The debt is paid. The girl is free.
Leave.
The boss hesitated, greed warring with pride. He looked at the money, then at Taewook's silent, lethal guard. He spat on the ground, nodded once, and turned away. It was anticlimactic, and yet it was everything. Violence avoided by the sheer weight of power and resources. Taewook turned back to the car. He walked through the rain that had started to fall, his hair plastering to his forehead. He opened her door. Imani practically fell out into his arms. He caught her, burying his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her, shaking slightly. It was the first time she realized how terrified he had been, not of dying, but of losing her. It is done, he murmured into her skin. You are free.
No that's.
No shadows. Imani pulled back to look at him, rain mixing with the tears on her face. Free to go? She asked, the question terrifying her. Taewook went still. He looked at her, water dripping from his lashes, vulnerability stark in his eyes. If you wish, he said, his voice breaking on the last word. I never kept you to own you, Imani. I kept you to keep you safe. It was the choice she needed. The door was open. She could take Sophie and leave. But looking at him, this dangerous, broken, beautiful man who had stood between her and the abyss, she knew there was nowhere else she wanted to be. I don't want to go, she said. I want to stay. With you? Taewook let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. He cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, and kissed her. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, tasting of rain and promise, a collision of 2 worlds that had finally stopped fighting and started merging. 6 months later. The Sophie and Bean bakery was already bustling, despite being open for only 2 weeks. The smell of cinnamon buns and roasted coffee wafted out onto the street, mixing with the crisp autumn air. Imani wiped her hands on her apron, adjusting the sign in the window. She looked tired, but it was a good tired, the exhaustion of building something of her own. She looked over her shoulder. Sophie was at a corner table, doing homework, kicking her legs which now wore brand new sneakers. And sitting across from Sophie, looking completely out of place in a cashmere sweater and dark jeans, was Taewook. He was helping her with a math problem, his expression serious and focused, using a napkin to sketch out a geometric proof. He looked up, sensing Imani's gaze. The cold, empty look that had defined him when they met was gone, replaced by a steady warmth. He didn't smile often in public, but his eyes crinkled at the corners when he saw her. He stood up, walking over to the counter while Sophie chewed on her pencil. The inventory delivery is late, Taewook noted, checking his watch, his protective confidence flaring up. Do I need to make a call? Imani laughed, reaching across the counter to take his hand. His grip was instant, firm, grounding. No calls, she said. It's just traffic. Relax. She traced the scars on his knuckles with her thumb. You're not the boss here, remember? Taewook leaned over the counter, disregarding the customers, disregarding the world. I know, he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead, then her lips. I am just the investor. And the security, he pulled back, his eyes serious and tender. And the man who loves you. The words were still new, still a marvel every time he said them. Imani smiled, her heart full. The ghosts of the past finally laid to rest. Go help her with the fractions, she teased gently. I've got the rest, as he walked back to the table, and Sophie laughed at something he said. Imani touched the spot on her jaw where the bandage used to be. The skin was smooth. The scar was invisible. She was seen. She was safe. And for the first time in her life, she was home.